In this lecture of the course, we want to learn about API gateway pattern and see what tools are available to implement the API gateway pattern. Please be advised that there is a service in Amazon Web Services called API Gateway. The pattern of API Gateway and the API Gateway service are two different things. So what is the API Gateway pattern? API Gateway stops the consumer of a microservice from directly accessing it, and therefore it removes the direct dependency of the client of a microservice on the actual microservice. So if we go back to the diagram of a microservices-based architecture, we will see that there is a web application that needs to talk to one or more microservices. And as we said before, it's not a good idea that we allow the website to directly talk to the microservices, because that would create a dependency. And if in the future we wanted to replace one of those microservices, change its interface, or even combine them together, then we would have to change the client-side website or application as well, and that would impact our customers. So to remove that dependency, as I said before, we place an abstraction layer called API Gateway between the consumer or web website and the microservices. API Gateway also simplifies the system's interface by combining multiple APIs into one. Imagine that your website needs one API, and that one API actually requires more than one microservice to work together in the background to generate the data that the website needs. So instead of a website being dependent on multiple microservices, it becomes dependent on one single API that is exposed by the API Gateway, and then API Gateway talks to the multiple microservices in the backend. API Gateway can perform authentication and authorization. We can obviously implement authentication and authorization in the microservice. However, because normally these types of operations, which we call cross-cutting operations or cross-cutting concerns, are repetitive, and we don't want to write the same code over and over again in every single microservice, we normally defer the authentication and authorization to the API Gateway. So once the API Gateway has successfully authenticated and authorized the user, then the microservices trust the API Gateway and they don't need to do the authentication themselves. API Gateway simplifies monitoring. So instead of, again, implementing the monitoring logic in every single microservice, we can implement it on API Gateway. So API Gateway can log information such as what user from which IP connected to which API, what they did with the API, how much data traveled over the network at API Gateway level. All that can be monitored for debugging, for security analysis, and use cases like that. API Gateway can also simplify the API catalog and documentation. Because APIs are not now scattered across our network and infrastructure, they are all in the same place within the API Gateway, then it's easier to catalog them, create a visualization of existing APIs, and also creating documentations for the APIs. This will increase the reusability of the APIs. So if I'm an architect or if I'm a developer, I can easily understand what APIs exist that I can reuse and what is their input, what is their output, and what is their behavior. So what are the common API Gateway tools? As I said, AWS has a service called AWS API Gateway, which is a managed service and is already there in AWS. It's very easy to learn, and also there is no complex setup required. You can choose to write a script using CloudFormation, or you can just choose to use the console of AWS to create your APIs. A downside of API Gateway in Amazon Web Services is that you need to create the API Gateway, or you need to set up API Gateway per API that you create. That means that if you're a developer and you're not really skilled with creating infrastructure, you're not a DevOps engineer, then you need to be dependent on a DevOps engineer to do it for you and to create the APIs for you. Another enterprise tool that exists in the market, and if you work for a large company and you ever need to think about using an API Gateway tool, I suggest that you think about Google APG. Google APG, as its name implies, is a Google product, and it's designed for enterprise level and use, so it's quite costly, and it supports various deployment models. For example, you can deploy it to AWS, you can deploy it to your own data center, or you can use it just purely as a SaaS service. Because it supports multiple and different types of deployment models, it can support hybrid cloud. For example, where I work, we have compute and data in Amazon Web Services, on Google Cloud Platform, and also on our own local data centers. With the help of Apigee, we have managed to set up an API gateway that is able to work with all these 3 different environments. As I said before, because Google Apigee is for enterprise level and for large companies, it's quite costly. And also it's quite complex to set up. You may need help from Google to basically design the way you want to deploy Google Apigee and deploy it. Another very popular tool for API gateway is called Kong. Kong is also an enterprise level API gateway and it's quite expensive. It's even more expensive than Google Apigee, but it supports a very high throughput. So if you work for a company that has millions and millions of users and the amount of requests that come through is really high, you may want to think about Kong. So let's move on to the next lecture and create the first API in AWS API Gateway. And then after that, we will create a microservice that connects to that API gateway and enables us to create hotels in our hotel booking system.